Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. In just a few days, hearings are slated to begin for Donald Trump's pick for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. The former Republican Party chairwoman in Michigan and chair of the pro-school choice advocacy group, American Federation for Children, DeVos is at the forefront of the movement to privatize public education by pushing for programs that use public funds to pay for private school tuition in the form of vouchers. She's also been a strong advocate for charter schools. Proponents of DeVos's ideas see charter schools and vouchers as reinvigorating a stale public educational system with competition and new ideas. Critics hold that vouchers and charter schools haven't performed well and threaten to undermine public education and will lead to profiteering off fellow citizens most in need of being educated. Today, we want to explore the nominee for Secretary of Education's plans for education. Should we embrace vouchers? To what extent are charter schools a good addition to traditional public schools? What's the future of educating our citizenry? We have a great panel today to discuss these issues. To my left is Todd Dorman, the Cedar Rapids Gazette columnist. Todd, thanks for being on. Sarah Hale Keuseman at the College of Education at the University of Iowa. Sarah, thank you for being on. And at the end, David Frisvold, an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Iowa. Dave, thank you for being on.
Thank you.
Well, Dave, maybe we could start with you. What exactly are the similarities and differences between traditional public schools and charter schools? What about the distinction between, for-profit charter schools and non-for-profit charter schools? And then what about these voucher schools? I think many of our viewers perhaps are going to be a little confused at first by these terms. I know that I was when I was first encountering them. Maybe you can help us get clear on what the basic terms that we're talking about are here.
Sure. So we have traditional public schools are publicly funded and publicly provided. And then charter schools are going to be publicly funded but not necessarily publicly provided. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that most often a nonprofit entity is going to decide to run a school, and what it's going to do is it's going to apply to the state, most often the state, and it is going to receive a charter for a different set of rules than what's often run through a traditional public school system. And so these rules are going to vary quite a bit, and they're going to cover things like the length of the school year, the length of the school day, teacher pay, teacher credentials, teacher qualifications, the curriculum. And so it's going to allow the school to vary quite a bit across charters, and it's going to allow charters to vary quite a bit from the traditional public school system.
Right, so we're going to see a lot more diversity among charter schools, perhaps.
Right, and I think one thing that's perhaps worth noting is we also may not have a lot of experience with charter schools or familiarity with a lot of the terms because they're not that common in Iowa.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So I think the most recent count is that there are 3 charter schools in the state, and so there's going to be a lot of variation in terms of how common charter schools are across mm-hmm. cities, across states.
Right, and so what about vouchers too? Let's get that in there real quick too. Right. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about vouchers?
So a voucher is going to be different because what happens is in a charter school, so I may go to a charter school, but I'm not paying them mm-hmm. To go there directly. In a voucher system, I'm going to receive a certain amount that I'm going to be able to use to then take that amount to any school of my choice.
Right.
And
I
so
think of almost like a coupon
different.
Or something. It's like the taxes get taken and I give you a little coupon and say, spend this as you want on
Right.
education.
And so that's going to be quite a bit different, because that's not necessarily the same experience that you have going to a charter school system.
Right. Well, Sarah, I know you've studied charter schools, so what would you like to add here to help people get a little more clarity about what
Right.
we're talking about and how they work?
So nationwide, about 4% of the nation's students attend charter schools. The first charter school law was passed in Minnesota in 1991, and then the first charter school opened there in 1992. And today there's about 6,000 charter schools across the country that enroll almost 3 million students. So the way that they look really differs state by state, because it's a state law that establishes the organizational structure that charter schools exist under. So they can range from for-profit institutions running them to independent entities running them. So about 60% of charter schools nationwide are run by independent organizations, and then the other 40%, most of them are run by charter management organizations out of the other 40%, which are organizations like KIP, that run multiple schools, and then the other ones are run by for-profit institutions. So like Dave said, there are 3 charter schools in Iowa that enroll about 300 students, and that varies greatly state by state. And bigger states like California, Wisconsin, and Arizona have huge numbers of charter schools.
Right. And what about something like Minnesota? You said they've kind of started this movement. So
Right.
how many
So
charter schools are there?
Just under 160 charter schools in Minnesota that enroll, I want to say it's like 50,000 students in Minnesota. So the way that things are run there, and it's interesting to talk about Minnesota because the way that they rank charter school laws, there's an organization that ranks them, and they've ranked Minnesota consistently among the top because they allow freedom to the way that those schools are structured and what people can do with the educational programs, but they also have a strong accountability program. So in Minnesota, each charter school is its own school district that has its own school board, where they have to have licensed teachers employed by that school who are on the school board helping to oversee the educational program.
Right.
Iowa, interestingly, is ranked out of the 43 states that have charter school laws. Iowa's ranked 41. So it's ranked pretty darn low there, in part because of its both its lack of freedom and the lack of accountability for charter schools here in Iowa.
I see. Okay, well, and maybe we can get to Michigan too, which Betsy DeVos has come from, but let's get Todd in on this. I mean, so Betsy DeVos, Trump's pick for Secretary of Education, has supported, among other things, virtual charter schools, private school vouchers. It seems clear that the direction she wants to go in is more choice, more private entities entering into the educational system overall. What's the promise of these possibilities? What are the perils? Is this a direction that we should be going in or not, in your view?
My own experience is basically watching Iowa politics for 20 or 25 years, I almost hate to admit. And 25 years ago, the political consensus in Iowa was that we have great public schools, they're a state treasure, and the political consensus may have differed. I mean, politics may have come into play on funding and things like that, but that was the consensus. Over time, that's changed. I mean, I could get far into the weeds on the way Iowa politics has changed, evangelicals taking a larger role in the Republican Party and things like that. But over time, there's been an erosion in that political consensus that public schools are great in Iowa. There are folks who think that they're not performing as well as they did years ago. There are folks that are worried about cultural concerns, religious concerns. And so by about the middle of the last decade, there began to be some talk about reform in Iowa. That's when the Iowa charter school law took effect. I think I was covering the State House when it was passed. It was originally a pilot program. They moved very, very slowly, hence there's only 3 schools. It was very restrictive. Fast forward to now, we've got a Republican legislature that's taken, just took office yesterday, and a Republican governor. And there's talk about, looking seriously at charter schools, broadening that effort in Iowa, and also vouchers, which in legislative parlance here is called education savings accounts, which would basically allow parents to access all or at least a portion of the per pupil funding that goes currently to a public school. They could use that for a parochial school, for a private school, and possibly for homeschooling, which is
right.
has a large constituency in Iowa.
Right.
So that's how it's happened in Iowa, and I think on the national level you've seen that movement move a little faster, especially in places where the perception that public schools were not of high quality, where that took hold a long time ago, especially in states with a lot larger cities and urban districts that weren't performing. The idea being if you allow people to keep some of that money, they can take their kids out of failing schools and put them in better schools. The charter school movement too is part of this idea that we want to let schools innovate, experiment,
right.
and be freed from some of the state regulations and things, while also though keeping some measure of accountability.
Right. But is this a direction we should be
going
in?
I mean,
you're saying we are sort of drifting towards
obviously,
that, but
you look at the election results, I think a lot of the exit polling talks about change. There's eroding confidence in a lot of public institutions in this country. I think schools are one of them. Now in Iowa, when you look at this debate, I'm not sure you can make this as strong a case that public schools are failing as you might in other states. I think most Iowans would still say that their local public schools are fairly high quality. But then you get into this notion of, is this to improve education or is it to deliver a portion of public funding to constituencies that the folks in power are more sympathetic to, hence folks especially that send their kids to religious education or who homeschool.
Right. Well, so I want to talk about both charter schools and vouchers, but I want to maybe start with vouchers just because maybe we can go to kind of the far extreme that way and then move back a little bit towards what we're more used to. What would be the effect of vouchers? Would they start to undermine public schools, or would they improve public schools by introducing some serious competition to them? Dave, do you have a sense of how we might think about this basic question of should we embrace these or not?
Sure. So it's it's a somewhat tough question in the sense of it's likely not going to be a one answer applies to everyone, right? So we have very little experience in the U.S. with vouchers to really have a great sense of how it changes the market for schools. And I should say schools are also quite tied to the housing market, right? So they can actually change neighborhoods and cities quite a bit if we completely reorganized from a, say, neighborhood public school system to voucher system. So we have some experience in Milwaukee, but otherwise we don't really have much large-scale experience with vouchers. Now, there's a handful of ways that others have, I guess, suggested the changes could occur, right? So the idea is that vouchers can enable individuals and parents and children to go to schools that best fit their interests, right? So this could be the example of parochial schools that you mentioned earlier. That could spur competition to potentially improve some of the public schools. That could spur competition amongst some of the new schools that start up. There's also some concern though, right? So part of the way it would work would be that parents or households would be making a choice as to which school the student attends. Now, not all households might be making an active choice, right? So there's some concern as to what would happen to the quality of the schools and the performance of the students who aren't in households that are making an active choice for which school to attend. And would those schools basically be left behind?
Right.
So there's potentially some variation in terms of how people will be affected.
Right, and isn't there a fear too that by introducing more of the profit motive there, in other words, people would think, okay, here's all of a sudden a lot of money that's available, and I can market my school, and perhaps you're going to market to people who are the least able to distinguish a good education from a bad education, or they're going to fall for what sounds great. and the motive would be to make money off of that. And one could imagine all sorts of ways in which all of a sudden many people will be taken for a ride. Some people might make lots of money, but we're talking about children's futures here, not just, you know, a pair of shoes or something.
Right. I mean, so, you know, part of the interesting thing is that, right, so the profit motive, in terms of over the long run, is going, could spur students or schools to perform the best they could, as opposed to trying to, you know, pull one over quickly over parents, because that's not a winning strategy over the course of many years, right? And so maybe, you know, those schools won't exist, you know, because they'll go out of business after a few years. So in the long run, that could work out quite nicely. But of course, if you're one of the students who is caught in that short run, then you could be potentially, you know, harmed in terms of your education outcomes, your labor market outcomes, which would be your lifetime earnings. And so we could have quite negative effects for those students.
Right. Well, and so Sarah, I mean, you've talked a little bit already about how there's a lot of variation, say, over charter schools about how much public oversight, but I take it when we get to something like vouchers, we're talking about, in a sense, almost no public oversight of the schools. Is that a problem to be moving away from public oversight, or is that actually a good thing and that it's going to introduce this competition that's going to make education better?
You know, I was reading up a little bit about like the voucher program in Milwaukee, and there's a little bit of you know, a little bit of public oversight, but not much. And so that's the question really that policymakers need to take a look at, and we as constituents need to take a look at, is where do we feel comfortable sending our public money? Is it to, you know, how much oversight do we want to see with the money that we're spending on education? So I think that's the big question. You know, I'm going to jump back a little bit, and you were talking about where politics are headed, and you were talking about the trajectory that you've seen in politics at the state level. And I think it's pretty interesting when you take a look at something like charter schools, because in this era of partisanship that we've had, it's a really unique policy feature that's really gotten support from both sides of the aisle. So some of the money that's come through the Obama administration with Race to the Top grants and things have encouraged states to lift caps on charter schools and things like that. So it's interesting because the number of students in charter schools has continued to grow pretty significantly, and it's getting support from both sides of the aisle. So I think it's probably something that many places, if not Iowa, are going to be seeing more and more of.
But I get a sense with vouchers, this might not be true. That, in other words, it might not be getting support from both sides of the aisle. That's what I mean. It seems like this is the more extreme case where people might, at least Democrats, if not some Republicans as well, might be thinking, wait a second here. You know, we need to have some commitment to public education, and this perhaps too deeply privatizes education. I don't know, Todd, I mean, do you think that?
Part of the debate is, I mean, the proponents of it proponents of vouchers will say the main objective of this is to give students who are in struggling schools, their parents, the ability to have choice and to do that. And in some cases that works. Indiana has a large voucher program, and what's been I recently read an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, where they talked about of those vouchers, only about 3% were being used by students who were leaving schools that had gotten low achievement grades or low F grades or whatever grade they give in Indiana. But more than half of the folks who got vouchers were students who had never been in a public school. So basically the vouchers were being used by people already going to private schools to basically offset part of that tuition.
So but doesn't that end up draining money from public education?
Is, are you improving schools? Are you increasing competition? Or are you basically just transferring public funds to folks that already aren't part of the public school system? And is that accomplishing anything other than transferring the resources to the other system?
And just real quickly before we move back to charter schools, which I want to get to, you know, is there any kind of like freedom of religion type conflict in the sense that you are all of a sudden using public money potentially to finance, say, a Catholic school or some religious school? Does that pose a conflict, or is that a fine, okay thing to give people that kind of choice? I'm happy for anyone to tackle this if you have a sense of it. I just was wondering about it when I was thinking it through.
I think politically, you know, you find, as you said, you won't find a whole lot of Democrats who are willing to support that, and you probably won't find some Republicans who are willing also to support that. So I think you know, I think there's some limit to the support there. Well, but there are definitely some people who do encourage that.
Right.
But you're right, charter schools have been more bipartisan, and really the fighting issue partisan-wise over that has been how much accountability do they have, how much control does the state exert over those schools. But I think, we've seen in Michigan, where, you know, Betsy DeVos.
Right, so let's maybe talk about that a little bit and move back to charter schools. So it seems like Michigan, in part based on the lobbying of DeVos, has a charter school system that's fairly free to operate.
You know, I read one place it referred to as the Wild West of charter schools.
Right. You know, so whereas in other states they can be shut down if they don't perform well, or there's a lot more requirements this seems fairly wide open. And also charter schools can make a profit in Michigan, as I understand it. Should we head in that direction? I mean, that seems to be what she's been pushing for very strongly. You know, is that the way that we should model our charter school system, or is it better to model the charter school system on something that is more highly regulated with a little more oversight from the government, where the government might say, look, you're failing, we're going to shut you down, or you're not performing as well as you really should be, or you're draining money from public education and not doing any better a job at what you do. So, you know, or whatever the system it is, where on that balance should we be aiming when we're talking about our whole country, or even just our own state here in Iowa? I'm happy for anyone to jump in on this one.
Right. I mean, so, you know, it's a good question, and I think a lot of it comes down to, right. So either way, it's still going to be a publicly supported institution or set of schools, right? So I think it comes down to, you know, why is it that we publicly support education? And what is it that we hope to achieve through publicly supporting education, right? So it's not, you know, that we want students that have the best test scores, right? It's, you know, a broad set of goals related to students being able to, you know, have opportunity related to, you know, I'd say earnings, choices that they are able to make later. You know, we want to publicly citizenship, you know, lower crime, and so, you know, there's a broad set of goals that we're hoping to achieve. And I think part of the difficulty is that it's really difficult to know, right? So as we focus on charter schools and the organization of charter schools and what effects do they have on students, or you know, the traditional public schools that are in the nearby, we tend to think about, you know, what's the impact on their test scores. But we don't create a system of education because we care in itself about test scores. And so this is where it's somewhat difficult, is what's the broader societal impacts. And I think that's where you hope that test scores can be some useful short-term marker. Because if they're not, and we're just trying to say which organization is going to help us improve student achievement, then we're not sure what's the cost and benefits.
But I take it that a lot, it's the test scores that's been used to kind of beat public schools over the head, right? In other words, so public schools are failing or they're doing a terrible job. Why? Well, because, you know, the test scores aren't where they're supposed to be.
Right.
So, I mean,
it seems
like if we're going to start to judge things on that way, we should do it fairly across the board, right?
Right. So, I mean, I think that's the question, right? So as we are focusing more narrowly on test scores, are we missing out on some of the larger benefits to society from this, right? So, and that's you know, I think how many charter schools are being judged. Similarly, how many traditional public schools are being judged. But I think in terms of you know, trying to think of like a broader question of should we be doing this, really gets at kind of more important issues of what are the larger societal benefits.
But let me, I mean, Sarah, let me ask you this. I mean, I kind of get the feeling sometimes that test scores also are kind of very limited way of looking at what an education does overall, and also very difficult to raise those test scores if you're dealing with students who are in poverty or, you know, having trouble to find something to eat, or, you know, I mean, in other words, it seems like there's so many complicated things. It's not just like, oh, if we make a few little changes, you know, everyone's going to jump up. And, you know, so I guess isn't one of the worries about charter schools overall that really all they're doing is taking public funds from public schools, putting them somewhere else, which may be giving some people more freedom and some more access, but overall, it's not really changing anything in the educational landscape, except perhaps diminishing some of the public schools that once were really, you know, doing real work to try to help out whatever populations they were serving.
So I've got two things that I want to talk about. One of them is the question of, you were talking about, should we be doing this? What are our goals? And I think that this push, as an educator, this push towards measuring education solely in terms of test scores is a trap for really failing to look at educating the whole child and educating for citizenship, to have to grow our country into being productive citizens. So when we take a look at should we be doing charter schools, when people ask me that, what I often say is that I think that charter schools are here to stay. I don't think that there's going to be 6 million students or suddenly someone's going to close charter schools and 6 million kids are going to have to find a new place to go to school or things like that. So I think that the ethical questions that we need to look at is how are we doing them and how can we do them better? And so I think what we need to be doing is taking a look at the policies at state levels that are going to create schools that are working to be the best possible for all of our students. So how can we make sure that schools like charter schools are going to be educating not only the best and the brightest, but also the kids that are at risk and the students with special needs and things like that. So these are the things that we need to be taking a look at and policymakers need to be taking a look at.
In other words, part of the beauty of what it started public education to begin with is the idea that we want to educate as many people as we can, as well as we can. Right. And it seems to me we need to keep that goal first.
So the idea behind charters was this idea of innovation, that in Minnesota they said we want to give teachers the idea, teachers and other people the freedom to create schools to educate kids in the best way possible outside of the constraints of this pretty tight system that's been going for 200 years in this country. There's been a few movements there where charters have the longest history in things where the teachers union in Minneapolis now has some charters to open up, or has a charter to open up schools
We're wrapping up, so try to keep your remarks real short here.
And some other schools that have innovated and combined back with traditional public schools. So.
Right. Well, very quickly, Todd, you want to get something in? We only have a few seconds.
Just saying, your best case scenario is if these charter schools become laboratories that produce transformational education policy that can be used by public schools, then your public investment makes sense.
Right. Well, I'm afraid we have a lot more to get to, but we've run out of time. But I'd like to thank you all for starting a great conversation. I think questions of education are central to who we are as a country. So I'm hoping the conversation we've started here is one that you continue in your homes and communities. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.